6 words. That is all it took. 6 words delivered without theatrics, without ceremony, without even the particular edge of aggression that the moment might have warranted. 6 words spoken in a plywood-walled briefing room somewhere in southern Iraq in the autumn of 2003, while the dust from the invasion still clung to everything and the full weight of what the coalition had walked into was just beginning to settle. A Royal Marine Color Sergeant, combat-worn, unhurried, sitting in the second row of a joint planning session attended by 24 American officers, raised his hand as the U.S. Marine Corps colonel at the front finished describing how the British contingent would operate within a counterinsurgency framework that had been drafted at a headquarters 9,000 miles away. The colonel had just used a particular word, a word with a very specific meaning inside the United States Marine Corps, a word that to the man sitting in the second row meant something else entirely, something that had gotten men killed. The color sergeant did not raise his voice, he did not stand up, he simply said, in a tone that was more patient than confrontational, more precise than angry. We don't use that word here. The colonel stopped. 40 seconds passed. A colonel does not often get corrected in a joint briefing by a non-commissioned officer from a partner nation. The room understood that something had just happened. And then the colonel, a man with 3 combat tours and a chest full of decorations, did something that very few senior officers in any military are conditioned to do. He picked up his pen. He crossed out the word. And then he looked at the color sergeant and said, "Tell me the right one." What happened in that room did not make the news. It was not classified as a significant event in the operational record. It was not cited in any after-action report that has been made public. But it was remembered, and it spread through the joint planning community in southern Iraq in the way that things always spread when they cut close enough to the bone. The story is not about a word. The word itself is almost beside the point. The story is about 2 military cultures that approached the same enemy in the same country through profoundly different frameworks, and what happened when those frameworks collided at the exact moment when getting it wrong would cost lives. To understand what the color sergeant said and why it mattered enough for a colonel to rewrite his briefing, you have to understand the difference between what the United States Marine Corps was in 2003 and what the Royal Marines had already been for half a century. The United States Marine Corps is the largest maritime infantry force in human history. In 2003, it fielded approximately 175,000 active-duty personnel. It possessed its own aviation arm, its own armor, its own artillery, its own logistics networks, its own intelligence apparatus, and a budget that dwarfed the entire defense allocation of most nations. It had fought in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Somalia, and now Iraq. It trained its soldiers hard, held them to a demanding standard, and produced fighters of genuine capability. The USMC's warrior ethos was built on an idea that had been remarkably consistent since the halls of Montezuma: aggression, speed, firepower, and the iron will to close with and destroy the enemy. You went to the Marine Corps to fight. The Royal Marines in 2003 numbered fewer than 6,900 full-time personnel. The entire organization, including its reserves, could fit inside a single American Brigade combat team. Its budget was a fraction of what the USMC spent on maintenance and logistics alone. Its amphibious shipping was limited, its helicopter assets perpetually under strain, and its political footprint in Westminster was a constant exercise in making the case for continued existence. By every metric of scale, the Royal Marines should have been an afterthought in a coalition dominated by American power. But the Royal Marines had something that numbers and budgets could not manufacture, and it was the thing the color sergeant was protecting when he corrected the colonel's word choice. They had 32 weeks. 32 weeks of initial training, the longest basic military training program of any combat troops in NATO. Every Royal Marine, officer and enlisted rank alike, completed it at the Commando Training Center Royal Marines at Lympstone in Devon. 32 weeks in which a civilian was methodically and without sentimentality transformed into something the Corps called a commando, not a soldier. A commando. The distinction is not semantic, it is architectural. It describes the structure of a man and what he was built to do. The training began with a simple, brutal stripping away of assumptions, not the deliberate breaking and rebuilding that some military systems employed. The Royal Marines did not believe in breaking men. Breaking implies destruction followed by reconstruction. What Limpstone did was different. It revealed. It applied sustained physical and psychological pressure until everything extraneous was stripped away, and what remained was what the man actually was underneath. The Corps wanted to see the floor of a man's character before it handed him a green beret. The green beret was not a reward for performance. It was certification that what lay below the surface was something the Corps could rely on when everything else had failed. The physical standards were severe in a specific way. The commando tests that concluded the training cycle had not changed in their essential form since the Second World War. A 9-mile speed march, a 6-mile endurance course through tunnels, water obstacles, and wading pools at Woodbury Common, concluding with a shooting test that had to be passed within 73 minutes after the physical exertion. A full assault course in fighting order. And then, last of all, the 30-miler. 30 miles across Dartmoor, one of the most unforgiving stretches of terrain in Britain, carrying a minimum of 32 pounds of equipment to be completed in 8 hours for recruits and 7 hours for officers. Dartmoor in winter is not a gentle landscape. The moorland sits at altitude exposed to Atlantic weather that arrives with no warning and no mercy. Rain that drives horizontally. Fog that reduces visibility to arm's length. Ground that is not firm underfoot, but a constant negotiation between the solid and the swallowed, bogs that take a boot to the knee, and paths that dissolve into the hillside. A Royal Marine died during this march in 2015. The march was not changed. The standard was not lowered, because the standard existed for a reason. The environments where commandos were sent were not more forgiving than Dartmoor. They were considerably worse. The attrition was significant by any measure. Approximately 40% of recruits who began training did not complete it. In some cohorts, the graduation group numbered barely a quarter of the original intake. And this was not the casualty rate of a broken process. This was the intended function of a system designed to discover, not create. The color sergeant in that briefing room had survived it. He had been through the endurance course, the assault course, the 30-miler, the close combat training on Woodbury Common, and the steep ridges of Dartmoor. He had passed through it not once, but continuously, because every time the Corps sent him into a new operational environment, the standard was reasserted. It was not a memory. It was a living thing. The word the colonel had used in that briefing was the phrase that American doctrine at the time applied to what the British would call hearts and minds operations. It described a framework in which military force was the primary instrument and population management was the secondary goal. A methodology of clearing areas with aggressive search and cordon operations and then transitioning to a stabilization phase once the kinetic work was done. It was a word that implied sequence. Clear first. Engage the population second. The approach had a logic to it that made perfect sense if you were describing the problem from the perspective of a very large military organization accustomed to achieving its effects through mass and firepower. The Royal Marines did not think in sequence. They thought in parallel. And the reason they thought differently was not philosophical preference, but institutional memory accumulated across operational environments where the American approach had not been available and where the population had not been an inconvenience to be managed after the fighting, but the actual terrain in which the fighting was embedded. Northern Ireland first. The Royal Marines had served in Northern Ireland continuously from 1969 through to the end of the Troubles, deploying through the most concentrated period of urban counterinsurgency that any British unit had faced since the Palestine Mandate. By 2003, the institutional knowledge embedded in the Corps from those decades was not theoretical. It was carried in the heads and the habits of men like the Colour Sergeant who had completed multiple Northern Ireland tours and who knew, without being told, that in a population where the enemy lived among civilians and depended on civilian support for survival and intelligence, the approach of the population was not Phase 2. It was Phase 1. It was always Phase 1. Because without it, there was no intelligence, and without intelligence, you were hunting blindly in a city of millions while the enemy watched you from behind their neighbors' curtains. The distinction the Colour Sergeant was drawing was between a framework that treated population engagement as a consequence of military success and a framework that treated it as the precondition for military success. These are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. And in southern Iraq in 2003, where the British sector around Basra and the surrounding provinces was an extraordinarily complex environment of Shia factions, tribal networks, ex-Ba'athist remnants, Iranian influence operations, and a civilian population that had survived decades of Saddam's brutality and was watching very carefully to see whether the new arrivals were different. The difference between those two frameworks was the difference between building something and burning it down. What had preceded that briefing room moment was worth understanding in full. On the night of March 20 into 21, 2003, 3 Commando Brigade launched one of the most complex amphibious operations undertaken by British forces since the Second World War. More than 2,000 Royal Marine Commandos from 40 and 42 Commando, supported by U.S. Navy SEALs, helicopter assets from both nations, and amphibious shipping staged in the Northern Gulf assaulted the Al-Faw Peninsula in southern Iraq. The objective was clear and urgent. The Al-Faw Peninsula controlled access to Iraq's oil export infrastructure. Saddam Hussein, in the hours before the invasion, had the demonstrated precedent and the operational intent to destroy it, as he had destroyed Kuwaiti oil facilities during his withdrawal from that country in 1991. An ecological and economic catastrophe had to be prevented, and it had to be prevented faster than any force moving overland from Kuwait could achieve. The assault had to come from the sea, and it had to come in darkness. 40 Commando was lifted by U.S. CH-46 Sea Knight and CH-53 Stallion helicopters onto the peninsula itself. 42 Commando took blocking positions to the north. Within hours, the oil infrastructure was secured. Within days, the peninsula was in British hands, and the brigade was pushing north toward Basra, Iraq's second city, a place of 1.3 million people that sat in the heat like a pressure vessel. Decades of oppression compressed into a city that the British were now walking into. Brigadier Jim Dutton, commanding 3 Commando Brigade, understood from the moment the brigade entered the Basra area that the military campaign and the population campaign were not separate things. His intelligence assets and his experience told him that Basra's civilian population was not hostile to the coalition arriving. But it was watchful. It was calculating. It had watched foreign armies before. It was measuring whether what was being promised would be delivered. The commandos who deployed into the city in the weeks following the invasion did not do so in armored columns designed to demonstrate firepower. They patrolled on foot. They removed helmets and set aside body armor in some circumstances to reduce the visual distance between themselves and the population. They used interpreters not as translators of orders, but as bridges into tribal and community networks that would take months to develop and that would prove irreplaceable when the insurgency began to mature. A Royal Marine corporal who served in Basra during this period and who was interviewed for a documentary by a British journalist described what the approach looked like from the ground. We didn't go in treating the population as the problem. We went in treating the population as the solution. Because they were. They knew where the weapons caches were. They knew who was who. They had been sitting on that information for years because there was no one they trusted enough to give it to. Our job was to become those people. This was not presented as doctrine in briefing rooms. It was not codified in a manual that had been written at a headquarters. It was institutional reflex, a way of operating that the Corps had developed across generations and that lived in the muscle and the judgment of its NCOs and officers, not as theory, but as practice. Which was why, when the colonel in that briefing room used a word that implied a different sequence, the color sergeant corrected him, not to be difficult, not to make a point about national pride or professional precedence, but because the word described an approach that his experience told him would produce the wrong outcome in the environment they were actually in. The colonel asked for the right word. The color sergeant gave it. What he offered instead was a description of an approach that did not think in phases at all. Not clear, and then engage. Not secure, and then stabilize. Simply, understand. Understand the environment first, continuously, at every level, and let understanding drive every action, including the kinetic ones. Because an operation that cleared a neighborhood with armored vehicles and search teams but left the population feeling occupied rather than protected had not cleared the neighborhood. It had fertilized it. It had created the conditions for the next generation of fighters who would emerge from those houses whose doors had been kicked in, and those families who had been humiliated in front of their neighbors, and those tribal networks whose sense of honor had been violated by the way the operation was conducted. This was what the Royal Marines had learned in Belfast and Derry and Armagh across 3 decades of operations, where the kinetic tools were available but were always calibrated against the intelligence dividend and the political consequence. A provisional IRA bomb maker captured by a raid that alienated the entire street and produced no follow-on intelligence was a tactical success and a strategic failure. A provisional IRA bomb maker turned into an intelligence source by patient relationship building in a community that had gradually come to trust the unit operating in it was a strategic multiplier that could not be priced. The Royal Marines who deployed to Iraq in 2003 had NCOs among them who carried this knowledge not as a lesson learned, but as a lived operational reality. The colonel rewrote his briefing not because he was told to and not because protocol required it. He rewrote it because when the color sergeant explained the distinction, the colonel's professional instinct recognized its validity. He was an intelligent officer in a military culture that, for all its size and power, had historically struggled with a particular kind of war they were now fighting. The American way of war had been constructed around the assumption of conventional military superiority. That superiority was real and it was overwhelming. But the insurgency emerging in Iraq in 2003 was not conventional. It was not susceptible to firepower alone. And the man sitting in the second row of his briefing had more accumulated operational experience of exactly this kind of problem than almost anyone else in the room. There was a second layer to the color sergeant's correction that the room perhaps did not fully grasp in the moment. When the Royal Marines operated in the Basra area in the months following the invasion, they were doing so in a sector that was structurally different from the American sectors in central and northern Iraq. The British sector contained a Shia majority population that had suffered disproportionately under Saddam. These were not people sympathetic to the remnants of the Ba'athist regime. They were people who had watched the Americans bomb Saddam's regime into collapse and had cautiously, tentatively, allowed themselves to begin believing that the moment they had waited decades for might finally have arrived. The window in which the coalition could capitalize on that tentative goodwill was not unlimited. It was measured in months, possibly weeks. Every operation that went wrong, every unnecessary confrontation with civilians, every display of force that was disproportionate to the actual threat in the room was spending down a credit that had taken decades to accumulate and could not be restored once spent. The color sergeant understood this because he had watched it happen before. He had watched it in Northern Ireland during the early years of the Troubles, when military operations that were justified on security grounds had shredded the political space in which a peaceful resolution might have been found earlier. He had watched the lessons learned from that experience reshape the way his corps operated over the following decades. He did not want to watch it happen again. The commando spirit. That phrase appears on the walls of every mess at Limpstone. It was codified formally in the values that every Royal Marine was required to articulate and to live: courage, determination, unselfishness, and cheerfulness in the face of adversity. These 4 words seem, at first pass, like the typical platitudes of any military ethos. Every military organization in the world has something similar on its walls. But what distinguished the Royal Marines version was the 4th element: cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Not merely resilience, not just endurance. Cheerfulness, the deliberate maintenance of a positive, engaged human disposition even when the physical and psychological conditions were making every instinct scream otherwise. This quality is not incidental to the story of the briefing room. It is central to it. A military that produces men who can maintain their humanity, their patience, their genuine engagement with the people around them under the worst possible conditions is not producing a nice-to-have cultural trait. It is producing a tactical capability. In a counterinsurgency environment where winning or losing turns on the population's decision about who to trust, a soldier who is surly, aggressive, or contemptuous of the civilians he is operating among is a liability regardless of his marksmanship. A soldier who can walk a night patrol through a Basra alleyway in body armor in 50-degree heat and still manage, when a frightened family opens their door at 2 in the morning, to communicate that he is not a threat, that he is trying to help, that he respects their home and their dignity. That soldier is worth 100 who cannot do this. The Royal Marines produced this quality deliberately. The 30-miler was not just about physical endurance, it was about discovering whether a man could maintain his wit and his generosity and his regard for the men around him when he had nothing left physically and everything in his body was demanding that he retreat into himself. Cheerfulness in the face of adversity was not a slogan, it was a standard. It was tested alongside the shooting standard and the navigation standard and the assault course standard, and it carried the same weight. What the color sergeant represented in that briefing room was the distilled product of a system that had been building this kind of man for over 80 years, and testing the product in environments where getting it wrong produced funerals. The broader operational record of the Royal Marines in southern Iraq bears this out in specific detail. In the months after the invasion, as the American sectors in Baghdad and the Sunni Triangle began experiencing the initial shock waves of an insurgency that would consume the next decade, the British sector around Basra remained comparatively stable. This was not universally the case, and it was not maintained permanently. The situation in Basra deteriorated significantly from 2005 onwards as Iranian-backed Shia militias moved into the political and security vacuum, and by 2007 the British position in the city was genuinely precarious. But in the critical window of 2003 and 2004, when the pattern of the occupation was being established, the British approach produced outcomes that their American counterparts studied with genuine attention. Patrols that operated without helmets in some circumstances, communicating a different posture to the population. Interpreters who were embedded in units long enough to develop real relationships with the communities they operated in, rather than rotated out every few weeks as if human relationships were interchangeable components. Civil affairs operations that were run not as a separate program managed from a headquarters, but as an integral part of every interaction between commandos and civilians, on the logic that every conversation was an intelligence operation and every gesture of respect was an investment in the next week's security environment. The American officers who observed this were not uniformly impressed. Some found the British approach under-resourced and tactically conservative. Some believed that the relative stability in the southern sector reflected the comparatively permissive Shia population rather than British operational skill. This critique had partial validity. The environments were genuinely different and comparison was complicated. But the officers who engaged most seriously with what they observed, including several who would go on to shape American counterinsurgency doctrine in the following years, came away with something they had not arrived with. They came away with a question, not whether the British approach was better in all circumstances, but whether the American approach had built-in assumptions about how force operated in a population-centric environment that needed to be interrogated seriously and not simply exported unchanged to every conflict. This was the question the color sergeant had put on the table with 6 words. The Royal Marines that deployed to Afghanistan starting in 2006 with 3 commando brigades rotations through Helmand Province were operating in an environment that was, in almost every respect, harder than what they had faced in southern Iraq. Helmand in 2006 was a province of extraordinary violence and extraordinary complexity. The Taliban had re-emerged as a genuine military force, not the disorganized remnant that many had expected. The Green Zone, the fertile agricultural strip along the Helmand River, was a honeycomb of compounds and irrigation ditches and poppy fields in which light infantry warfare was being waged at close range with a lethality that shocked observers accustomed to thinking of the Afghan campaign in terms of airstrikes and long-range engagements. And 42 Commando conducted operations in Sangin, now Zad, and the district centers of Helmand with a tempo and an intensity that produced significant casualties. The names of towns that the rest of the world had never heard became coordinates of meaning inside the Corps. Now Zad, Sangin, Garmsir, Musa Calais. These were places where Royal Marines fought and died in conditions that had changed very little in the fundamental physics of infantry combat since the Second World War. Close range, limited cover, extreme heat, terrain that favored the defender absolutely, a population that had been living under Taliban authority and was weighing every action by every coalition force against the certainty that the coalition would eventually leave and the Taliban would eventually return. The skills the color sergeant had been defending in that Iraqi briefing room were the skills that kept men alive in those compounds. The ability to read a situation rather than default to the template. The capacity to make the rapid intuitive judgments about threat and intent that only come from accumulated operational experience. The patient, persistent engagement with local leaders that produced the intelligence which told a patrol where not to walk, and which compounds were being used for something that required investigation. 42 Commandos J Company conducted a 10-day combat reconnaissance patrol through northern Helmand in 2007 that covered more than 300 miles of the most contested terrain in the province. They moved through Sangin, Nowzad, and Musa Calais, sometimes meeting Taliban forces in open engagement and sometimes moving, through villages where the reception was cautious but not hostile and where the patience and the cultural instinct of the commandos determined whether they left with intelligence they could use or enemies they could not afford. The patrol produced a picture of the operational environment in northern Helmand that no satellite and no drone could have generated because it required human presence in the spaces between the positions, the willingness to stop and talk and listen and interpret, the capacity to hold the complexity of the environment without reducing it to the simple binary of cleared and uncleared. This was the direct inheritance of what the color sergeant had been describing when he corrected the colonel's word. The word the colonel had used implied that there was a phase in which the fighting happened and a subsequent phase in which the human dimension was addressed. The Royal Marines had learned across operations stretching from Malaya in the 1950s through Cyprus, Borneo, Oman, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Sierra Leone, and now Iraq and Afghanistan that there was no such sequence. The human dimension was not subsequent to anything. It was simultaneous with everything. It was the medium in which all military action took place, and ignoring it did not make it go away. Ignoring it made it hostile. The colonel, whose briefing was rewritten that afternoon, subsequently deployed with his battalion into the British sector for a period of joint operations. Several American officers and NCOs who served in that joint capacity have described the experience in terms that echo what American Special Operations personnel said about operating alongside the SAS. The culture shock was real, and it operated in both directions. American Marines were frequently better equipped, better supported, and more capable of generating immediate mass and firepower. Royal Marine Commandos were frequently operating with a situational awareness of their environment and a granularity of human intelligence that the Americans found almost incomprehensible to generate through their own methods. A U.S. Marine captain attached to a Royal Marines company during a joint patrol operation in the Basra area in early 2004, speaking later to a journalist researching the British approach, described a specific incident. The patrol had been moving through a market district when the Royal Marine Troop Sergeant, without any apparent signal, changed the patrol's route. When the captain asked afterward why the change, the sergeant explained that a man he had spoken to 3 weeks earlier in that district had not made eye contact with him as they passed his shop. 3 weeks earlier. One conversation. One small deviation from an established pattern of behavior in a man he had spoken to briefly and once. The sergeant had logged it, weighed it, decided it was worth acting on, and changed the route of a patrol through a built-up area in real time based on that single data point. An hour later, a device was found on the original route. There is no technology that produces that capability. There is no intelligence system that generates that kind of granular, human, pattern-based situational awareness from a single brief conversation 3 weeks in the past. It is a product entirely of training, experience, and institutional culture that has been teaching men to trust precisely this kind of observation for generations. The color sergeant who corrected the colonel's word had this capability. Every man in the room who had been through Limpstone and through the operational pipeline the Corps ran its people through had a version of this capability. The correction he made was not about doctrine in the narrow sense of preferred terminology. It was a defense of the entire philosophical architecture that made that capability possible, because the wrong word led to the wrong plan, and the wrong plan led to operations that spent down the human capital of the environment and made the next week's work harder, and the week after that harder still, until eventually you were operating in an environment that was actively hostile in proportion to the intelligence you had, squandered. The colonel understood this. That was why he picked up his pen. There is a word inside the Royal Marines that has no real equivalent in any other military culture. The word is used casually, constantly, as a form of address and description and cultural shorthand that carries within it the entire accumulated weight of what the Corps is and what it requires of those who belong to it. The word is bootneck. It means, roughly, Royal Marine Commando, but it means much more than that in practice. It means a man who has been through Limpstone and who therefore carries in his body and his reflexes and his judgments a particular way of being in difficult places that was forged at the bottom of Dartmoor's River, crossings and on the exposed ridges above Woodbury Common and in the killing house where the shooting drills were done until the hands moved, without the brain's permission. It means a man whose baseline assumption about hardship is different from most people's ceiling. When a colonel rewrites his briefing because a bootneck told him the word was wrong, it is not a moment about the relationship between a non-commissioned officer and a commissioned officer or between a British serviceman and an American one. It is a moment about accumulated knowledge meeting institutional assumption. It is a moment about the kind of expertise that does not fit neatly inside a rank structure because it was acquired across decades of operational experience in environments that cannot be replicated by any training program. The Royal Marines have been in continuous existence since 1664. 360 years. Every generation has fought a different war, and every generation has returned something to the institutional knowledge of the Corps that the next generation could draw upon. The storming of Gibraltar in 1704. The amphibious operations of the Napoleonic Wars. The Zeebrugge raid in 1918. The commandos of the Second World War who created the template that every special operations force in the Western world has since adapted. The Falklands in 1982, where Royal Marines yomped across 60 miles of frozen moorland with full fighting loads in conditions that broke lesser units. Northern Ireland across 30 years. Sierra Leone in 2000, where a small British force deployed and stabilized a country in the time it took most armies to write their planning orders. And now, Iraq and Afghanistan. The color sergeant in that briefing room carried all of this, not as history, but as identity, as the thing that told him what the word meant and why it mattered and why it was worth raising his hand in a room full of American officers to say, quietly and without drama, "We don't use that word here." The colonel, to his very considerable credit, asked for the right one, and the right word was not a tactical term or a doctrinal concept or a phrase from a manual. The right word was the one the Royal Marines had been using in different forms since the first commando training began in the 1940s. The right word was simple. It was 2 syllables. It described not a sequence of military actions, but a quality of presence in a difficult place. It described what it looked like when men who had been selected for their depth of character and trained to the limit of human endurance walked into a population that was afraid and uncertain and waiting to see whether the new arrivals were different from the last ones. The right word was understanding. Understanding first. Understanding throughout. Understanding as the foundation on which every other capability rested, because without it, all the firepower and all the technology and all the logistics in the world produced not victory, but a different kind of defeat. The colonel wrote it down. The briefing was changed, and somewhere in the operational record of southern Iraq in the autumn of 2003, in a sector that was fractionally quieter than it might have been because of how a small number of men who wore green berets had chosen to walk through it, that conversation had its consequences. Not in a headline, not in an after-action report, in the particular silence of a street where the patrol had been expected and the bomb had not been placed. That silence is the whole story.